So, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to meet you. Good evening, Professor Clune. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to have you here once more with us by Zoom. I prepared a little welcoming, Well, today we have the great honor of receiving at the University of São Paulo Law School for the second time, thanks to Zoom, Professor William Clune. Professor Clune, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. I'm going to do a short presentation of Professor Clune. He is a Vos Bascom Professor of Law Emeritus in the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is also the director of the policy group at the National Institute for Science Education and a senior researcher at the Consortium for Policy Research in Education. He has a long career in teaching and researching and a large experience in public policies, especially in the education field. He has also taught law and public policy at La Follette Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin. Moreover, he authored many seminar articles in law and public policy. As Professor Tavares of Goiás Federal University said a couple of weeks ago, when I presented Clune's work to the community of researchers in the Law and Public Policy Master's Program, this is a kind of archaeological work of rediscovering an important author many years after their works has been published. This is the case with the 3 fine papers on law and public policy we have been working on in the last years, eventually translated into Portuguese. We are talking of a political model of implementation for public policy, in Portuguese, modelo político de implementação, law and public policy, map of an area, direito e políticas públicas, mapa da área, legal disintegration and a theory of the state, desintegração jurídica, uma teoria do Estado. More recently, in 2021, Professor Clune published the book, Legal Realism to Law in Action, about innovative methods and political sense in the history of University of Wisconsin Law School, Madison. Finally, very generously, he accepted to register the dialogue we had when I was in Madison last February in an original fashion, a dual blog. So tonight I have the pleasure to pitch in Brazil the dual blog, composed of 2 articles published on the new Legal Realism site under the title, Bucci and Clune, a South-North Dialogue. My acknowledgement to Professor Elizabeth Mertz for receiving the article and, of course, to Professor Clune, who provided for the publication. This title was suggested by the publisher, instead of the form I have suggested, the North-South Dialogue. But Professor Clune saw further. He talks about an intercultural or cross-cultural dialogue, and he's right. These days, when democracy is under attack, even in developed countries, the reconstruction of the social state, a hallmark of progressivism, wherever it has appeared, is a challenge that requires the confluence of the efforts of many experiences from different countries and cultures. Organizing collective action for a purpose requires a method to build aggregate social knowledge. The experience of public policies during the democratic period left deposits, to use Professor Clune's geological language, for the alluvial state. Without epistemic models to structure this set of experiences on a large-scale basis, the power of these innovative interventions is lost. Clune's models shed light on the directions for an LPP approach. The frameworks I have been working on in the last years can be seen as part of a similar movement. Tonight, in the second part of this class, as a part of the cross-cultural dialogue, 5 researchers from University of São Paulo Law School will present some application of these models and other frameworks of LPP they have elaborated on. Professor Clune, thank you once more for this dialogue. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Maria Paula. It's a pleasure, and congratulations to all of your students and colleagues. I know many of you are dissertators and have been judges, and so I think you're both students and colleagues to both of us. And I think your projects are excellent and are fitting the law and public policy model perfectly. I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about them some more later. So I want to talk today about the 3 readings that were assigned: Map of an Area, the blog, and the research questions and methods. So the Map of an Area article says that progressivism is in constant tension with free enterprise, and the welfare state is subject to swings in policy, always with the possibility of crisis. The blog talks about a recent big swing in policy and the possibility of a major crisis in democracy in this country. So the dynamics of the welfare state described in Map of an Area is the same, but as the blog says, the power has shifted to the right. Some pieces of the regulatory state remain in place: infrastructure, social security, securities regulation, and so on. At the most general level, progressivism is a battlefield mostly characterized by partisan gridlock, stagnation, and small moves in one direction or another. I'm looking over to my notes in case you're wondering why I'm swinging my head back and forth. So I said to Maria Paula that perhaps there are 3 kinds of welfare states: stable, contested, and illiberal. Both the US and Brazil seem to be in the contested category. A colleague of mine suggested that some illiberal welfare states may be populist in the sense of supporting the working class, such as Orban's Hungary, perhaps following Mussolini way back, and or the Peronists in Argentina. So welfare states do not necessarily protect democracy. The problem in the United States is all the money that's concentrated at the top and its influence on politics. In a way, the conservative agenda is pushing wealth stratification by means of culture wars that reinforce existing racial and ethnic stratification. Also, the US Senate is biased towards small conservative states. Democratic senators, 25 of them, represent 40 million more people than the conservative states. And of course, it takes 60 senators to overcome the filibuster that's in place now. And this is also a big problem with gun control, which is very sad and very topical at the moment. So here you have a special set of legal structures that operate to as the milieu of what we do with progressivism or we don't. I think those things lead to looking for bipartisan solutions and to staying active at the regional and state and local levels, and waiting for possible shifts in preferences of the electorate. The conservative states tend to have the fewest minorities, the greatest fear of minorities, and the least, and of course, they tend to be rural states with not much sympathy for the big cities where most of the people live. So that's kind of a short story of why we're a bit frozen in time at the moment. So the next topic, instability, excuse me, institutional stability of progressive laws and systems. So the Map of an Area mentions that regulatory institutions that steer the economy and provide for human development take time to enact, build, and refine. And one strategy of conservatives is weakening and destabilizing these complex institutional structures. Our conservative Supreme Court helped in this effort, withholding striking down welfare legislation and limiting agency power. Research on our court has built a strong case that historically it's been a reactionary institution, with the exception of the Warren Court, the Great Warren Court from about 1955 to 75, which has tended to strike down a progressive legislation and failed to protect democracy. By the way, when I say progressive, I'm using it as a synonym for movements toward the public good and toward equity through law. So courts can tear down complex institutions, but are powerless to rebuild them. That's one great problem that we have. So we have instability of institutions underlying the instability of policies. This is quite dangerous because when institutions are needed, they may be missing in action, as has happened to some extent during the pandemic. So this sounds like a gloomy picture. Is there a silver lining? There is, and I would say that progressive reforms are always present, planned, and ongoing at every level. They may be bigger or smaller in scope and occur in every area of public policy: health, education, urban planning, affordable housing, sanitation, and so forth, many of the things that you are studying. And they can be studied with different research designs and different depths. Reports and theses can be longer or shorter. There's no end to progressive reforms to study, and there never will be. Keep in mind that with the idea of of all of my articles, we can have forward motion and backward motion in progressive reforms and in the welfare state generally. So we're always going in one direction or another, and either way we can study it. So it's a great field for lawyers who are active in public policy and for law and public policy researchers. Maria Paula and I have been discussing how to describe the roles of lawyers in law and public policy. Both roles require a sophisticated understanding of the framework for law and public policy, but with different skills and roles. I think we will be writing some more about that in the future. So now let's think a little bit about the checklist of research questions guiding research on law and methodology and law and public policy and the methodology. So I don't know if you have the research questions in front of you. I will, I guess, maybe read them over quickly. What's the area to be researched, namely law and public policy? Plans or opportunities to advance public good through a change in policy or implementation of policy. Policy refers to laws, rules, and official practices, that is collective action. And public good refers to an increase in general welfare, including equity, or of course also to a decrease, because we can always be moving forward and backward with with resistance if backward. And what social and economic benefits are intended and for which social groups? What kind of politics will be required to make new policy or modify an existing policy, including the politics of holding existing policy in place and those supporting change? What are the new models being relied upon in use elsewhere or specified in theory? How do technology and financial resources figure in? How will the efforts to change policy be organized? Who are the actors seeking change and those opposing change? And what's a good model for evaluation of the intended process, policy changes, and outcomes? And how can the model be used to track changes as they occur in the past or currently, including shifts and compromise? So that was a quick run through of those. I would say they're law-centric, but also involved an interdisciplinary perspective. They involve existing policies and proposed policies, a plan for change. resources and technology. Plan for evaluation. I have a sites in my notes for the logic model, which I've used and really hundreds and thousands of evaluators in educational programs and health programs have used a logic model of anticipated activities, implementation, and expected outcomes. And so that's a basic sketch of the theory of change, and it can be helpful in organizing one's thinking. What is the plan, and what are the activities that will take place? How will they be implemented, and what are the expected outcomes? And that can be a basic sketch or something more longer and formally developed. So then, in terms of the research method, Maria Paula, will you tell me if I'm running out of time and I should shift to your comments?
No, you have plenty of time. We are here to hear you.
Okay.
Go ahead. Feel free.
So I had included a graphic in my notes of how to organize research, and you see that it's research is this is not just law and public policy. This is almost any kind of social science research from the Sage Foundation. It's theory driven, based on a literature review. The literature review leads to a framework or theory and research questions. And so we are working on a theoretical framework of law and public policy. That's the one we're working with. And then I have some material on case studies, which I think fit all of the abstracts that you sent me of your students and colleagues' work. Case studies are well suited for research on law and public policy because it almost always involves multiple actors with different agendas, complex politics, unique social and economic contexts, and so forth. The research requires delving into these complex settings, unpacking, decoding, surfacing, and explaining patterns. So that's sort of the art of doing case studies. And so if that's the method, what about research design? So a lot of times I've noticed in the US, people will pay attention to theory and method, but not think too much about research design. Is it cross-sectional, looking at a point in time? Is it longitudinal, looking at change over time? Is it longitudinal based on secondary sources or primary sources? Or is it longitudinal, actually studying an ongoing reform on site? And so those are all different kinds of research designs, which can all be studied through case studies. So my article on the political model article is a cross-sectional with some historical longitudinal emphasis. And the blog is on the recent history of progressivism, was deliberately chosen as a longitudinal study of research in the Free Enterprise Act of State, drawn entirely from secondary sources, that is, with no original collection of data. And then you can, but there's also you can study ongoing reforms in a longitudinal way and keep track of what's happening. So what about data? Well, data for law and public policy case studies is typical of case studies in general. Qualitative research drawn from a wide variety of sources appropriate for the research questions. Sources like legal materials, background research on the type of policy to be studied, interviews with policymakers and stakeholders, program publications, observations, journalistic sources, and other opportunistic data. There's a lot of possible sources. So I'm about to conclude, and a question for everybody is, what is this is this research set of research question useful? What's missing? I'm going to look at the chat now and see what it's saying. Link to video. Some of the.
I think no one posted any. We can invite people to contribute.
Okay.
Make comments
Yeah.
on what you're saying. So everyone feel free to make comments to put comments on the chat, so that this dialogue can go on.
I think later we can actually talk some about the work that the students and colleagues are doing with you, Maria Paula. So I'm done with.
Well,
quick summary.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's very, very provocative and very interesting, and it's a very, as I said before, a very generous dialogue, because you have written some truly monumental articles. Each time I read the political model, I discover things. It's difficult to make a synthesis and to see where to progress. I would like to point out just 5 or 6 remarks for us to go on. Beginning by the end, I think you propose a very rich framework, and we are going to need time to process it and to explore all the possibilities in our research field. But I would like to begin for what I've commented, some assumptions about the state before arriving at the dialogue about law and public policy. And they are going to be 7 remarks. First of all, the need for reconstructing the welfare state. So this is the first intriguing question. The departing point of this reflection is the need for reconstruction the welfare state. It has been said that the post-pandemic period requires the most active presence of the state. Some initiatives have been created in this sense. In the post-Trump period, in the USA, despite the difficulties for the most ambitious proposals for the Democrats' federal government, programs supported by a bipartisan coalition have been approved, as you point out in your blog text. This is, I think, is something unexpected. For this reconstruction, there are specific political changes, such as the renewal of political parties and practices. Moreover, the impacts of new forms of work organization and social relations, such as social media, shall be integrated into the perspectives of the state action. The world still expects an efficient regulation that protects us against the abuses from oligopolistic social media business, such as Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft. It seems no government has the power to block these abuses. Nevertheless, the reorganization of the economy will not come unless the state plays a role in regulating the market and coordinating private and governmental activities to foster human development at the same time. This was my first remark. The welfare state is coming back. We don't know exactly from where. Second remark, what's next? Yeah, from where? The answer shall be searched for in the long run, not in the immediate past. And this is the way I read your comment on the longitudinal perspective. Besides being a research strategy, I think it's a way of viewing what's going on and not panicking from the immediate effects. There has been a history, a century history of achievements of the social state. So let's understand this process. And I'm going to quote a sentence you used in one of your texts. What does longitudinal perspective means? Longitudinal, that is a study of change over time. The longitudinal context is the long history of progressivism in the United States, including the recent conservative counter movement. It's something I think like as what Fernand Braudel called the longue durée. So what's going on is not the end of the world, it's one step when the counter movement is leading the process. They are winning, but we hope that we can set and establish another direction for this movement. Third remark points out the relation among the social state and the state and public policies. And I think is pressure, your metaphor, on the alluvial state. The alluvial state is defined in political model this way: taken collectively, implementations constitute the modern state. Multiply any particular implementation in the diverse areas of substantive policy by 10,000, and the result is the welfare state and regulatory state. Implementations are the alluvial formative process of the modern state. And law as a state is the sum total of the structures and continuing interactions left as deposits by a multitude of separate implementations. I think this is very important due to this sensation, to this perception of the doomsday we are living, you know, as if the destruction of democracy that we are living in Brazil, and I think you have lived this in the US since a year ago, left us without perspective. What are you going to move to go forward? Then I'm going to point out my fourth remark on the progressivism. You have already commented this, what I call the transformation drive. In current times, it is counterintuitive to talk about progressivism and the reconstruction of the welfare state, since we are living in different parts of the world in a period of retrenchment. We see coordinated attacks against the institution of democracy and the idea of collective good. However, there are social forces moved by a transformation drive that remains in dismal scene. Besides political minorities such as feminists, Afro-descendants, and LGBT movements, even traditional movements such as unions must update their narratives to keep track of political disputes. The plans of action of these movements must take into account not nostalgia for past good times, but the strategies learned then to build coalitions. Making alliance about progressive measures is something that gains a lot with a repertoire of legal proposals and experiences. Well, you remarked that, and you just said this, there are motions, small moves in one direction or another. Progressivism can never die, but it is ever present in larger and smaller ways at every level of government. Something always needs to be done, and groups are always arising with solutions. My fifth remark is about the intercultural dialogue. This, I think, is very clever, the way you put it. Since movements from the developing world start to organize themselves, exploring the cleavage between central, north, and peripheral countries, global south, the dialogue among them has evolved. The so-called South-South dialogue has contributed with a critical view to the idea of importing institutions from the developed world as a means to accelerate the path to development. However, this cleavage masks the fact that in the meso level, considering not the main political movements, but the measures in the intermediate level of implementation, there can be many similarities between the experiences in the developed and developing world. Despite the difference in the macro level, such as ones that come from the position in the colonial history, nothing blocks the South to learn from the North and vice versa. For instance, the legislative control of a policy, as Clune analyzes in Political Model about the equal spending on men's and women's intercollegiate sports, is subject to the pressure of interest groups, following patterns that shall not differ essentially in different countries. all these presented, all these assumptions, the 6 assumptions, we could delve into the main issue that brings us here, is that the importance of the theory and models for research in LPP. And I'm not getting long in this. I just want to make one remark, is that I think the political model of implementation, especially this article, does a kind of job similar to the one that has been done in law and economics with law and politics and law and public policy. It shows, it presents in a structured way many plans or many layers of different dimensions of relationships between law and public policy. I'm going to remark one point. In the political model, there's this definition. The model is political in the sense that the 2 phases of law making, policy formation and implementation, are represented as a process of struggle, conflict, and compromise among contending interest groups. The law is simply the equilibrium struck by the contending forces at any given stage of the process. So law is struggle, law is conflict, law is compromise, law is politics. And nevertheless, the law is more than simply a political prize or compromise. It is a very special kind of prize or compromise. The structure of a law and its legislative history not only may reveal the nature of underlying social aspirations, but also may help to explain the technical scope and limits of legal enactment and social purpose. And this structuring perception it comes to other debates, such as the problem of law and substantive rationality, the consequentialism, and the law and political compromise. How does these 2 movements, can they compromise? Can they affect the integrity of law? And the answer is no. And there is not a close answer. This opens many possibilities for this dialogue in terms of building strategies, research strategies. And I think I'm going to stop here to let the researchers show their presentations and to let more space for this debate and for the questions from both from the students which are in the room. So feel free to put questions, to make questions through the chat, and to use the YouTube chat as well. And I'm going to bring the questions to inside the room. So this was my remark.
So if we are not running out of time, if I may,
No. Sure,
a little bit
not
to
at
those
all.
comments, which were so excellent. And I wish I could read these chat questions better. I'll try in a minute. I did see one. So as I've thought more and more about this and worked with you, Maria Paula, I've come to think in talking about the welfare state, I'm thinking of it more as a collection of public interest actions at the national level, the regional level, the local level. And you mentioned substantive rationality. I think so. It's a kind of bricolage of actions all over the place that are going on. To some extent, if things aren't satisfied in the national government, they have to be worked on locally, but to some extent, things can only be worked on locally. And one thing that underlies my thinking, I believe, is a sort of functionalism, but it's a political functionalism. It is that problems arise and need solutions. And it's not that these happen automatically, but there are constituencies, sufficient everywhere to initiate change or efforts at change. And so that's what keeps the progressive or public interest ball rolling. And so we have an interdependent society. We have lots of inputs from constituents, in democracy and otherwise. There's a very rich literature on how cities that succeed in being prosperous in the United States, what are they like as opposed to those which aren't so successful? For example, one city in California has succeeded very well against the drought, and another has not. And what you see is that locally there's a bringing together of technical and legal expertise with lots of human capital. There's always a university involved to have researchers, and so there is this process going everywhere. So I would see a montage of welfare states or welfare statism, I guess, that's occurring everywhere. So I think that fits what you just said. And and then one of the questions was about the distinction between stable and contested and illiberal states. That's a very rough distinction. I had in mind stable ones would be Western European, Germany, Scandinavia. One of my colleagues said, well, in Sweden, they're having very large kind of uprising against immigrants, right? And that's one of the elements that sort of destabilizes things. So it's not so simple to say it's stable. But social democracy is kind of institutionalized and not too threatened. The democracy part is working okay. And then the contested are ones where actually there's very resistance to going farther at the national level with human development and progressivism. And one of the tools is to suppress or subvert democracy, because that's a potential source of reform. And so that's the reason we have illiberalism. And so Orban in Hungary's taken control of the judiciary, and he's taken control of the media and so it's becoming, there's still a democracy, one with a large fraction of the vote, probably because he does subsidize bread and fuel prices and things like that. He's a populist in that sense, but he's also limiting democracy as an input to progressivism. So I guess I would, I think that's enough for me to say in reaction, but those were very rich comments, Maria Paula. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. We have a lot to discuss, but I wonder if we can pass to the presentation of the researchers, and so we have time to some comment as well. Can we?
Let's do that, please.
Okay. So, following the order I have previously set, I would invite Sergio to start his presentation. He will present also a slide show.
Okay. Can you all see my PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Professor Maria Paula Dallari Bucci. Thank you, Professor William Clune. It's a pleasure to be here. In the next 8 to 10 minutes, I'll try to present a summary of the research I did during my master's. And the research aimed to analyze the national basic sanitation policy in Brazil. So, next slide. Okay. First, it is important to say that the issue of the sanitation is closely linked to the realization of basic social rights, such as the right to health, the right to the environment, or even to education. And today, in terms of the statistics, we currently have a very bad situation in Brazil, mainly in terms of sewage collection and treatment, as you all can see in this graph. There have been many advances in the last decades in terms of supply of drinking water, but today only half of the population of Brazil has their sewage collected and treated. Then we ask ourselves, why is this so? And what role did law and legal institutions play in this situation? So initially, I must say that the National Basic Sanitation Policy in Brazil has political and legal components, and that's why the relationship between politics and law is essential to better understand this policy. So interdisciplinarity was not an option for me, but a necessity for the research. The idea was to carry on an investigation that could generate better results than those of a purely legal analysis, and could also go beyond the limitations of political science works that do not take into account or into consideration the legal dogmatic problems. In this sense, the historical new institutionalist view of political science proved to be very useful to this work, which comprises three basic assumptions. 1, institution condition behavior. 2, institutions distribute power unequally. And 3, institutions have a conditioning trajectory, the so-called path dependence. There is also an important tool, the analysis of veto points. Veto points allow political decisions to be made or aborted at different stages of the public policy creation process, depending on the characteristics of each political system. What I tried to do here was analyze the institutional legal arrangement of the policy, as well as its evolution, to identify legally qualified veto points, that is, the veto points expressed through legal norms. For this, there are two interesting aspects to be highlighted. These aspects will later guide the legal analysis of the veto points. So, first, a framework of interests. As you can see in the table, one interest group understands that the competence, responsibility, and ownership of the service, and of course, the right to charge for it, belongs to the municipalities. Another group understands that it belongs to the federal states. And regarding the form of the provision, one group understands that the best way is to provide the service directly by the government, and another group understands that the service must be provided by private sector, by private companies through concession contracts. And these interests can combine with each other, as the table shows. It is also important to say that these are not just common interests of social groups. These interests are based on the vision and interpretation that these groups have of constitutional rules and attribution of powers and functions in the Constitution. So, in addition to the interests, another important framework is that of actors. In this slide, I'll try to classify the actors according to their function and according to the sanitation law approved in 2007, and of course, the Constitution. Here, we have 6 defined and separate actors or roles: operator, owner, regulator, planner, financier, and social controller. Some of them are also subdivided, such as the operator, which can be a private or public company, or the regulator, which can be at different federal levels. And this subdivision continues on other levels, as the full image on the screen demonstrates. Having made these considerations, it's important to highlight that the research considers, following the idea proposed by Professor Maria Paula, that all public policies are formed by legally structured processes. I choose to analyze 3 of them that seem to me most relevant to the case. There are others such as electoral process and budget process, but my focus here was on these 3. The idea was to look at each one of these 3 processes, considering the framework of interests and actors presented above. So first, the legislative process. I examined the process of the various bills in the Brazilian Congress until reaching the sanitation law of 2007, which was the first relevant legal framework in Brazil in terms of public basic sanitation. And I analyzed how the interests and actors described above used the veto points in this process. Second, the judicial process. At this point, I highlighted a very famous case in Brazilian Supreme Court, in which it was decided whether the federal states or the municipalities were the competent entities for exploring the sanitation service. It should be noted that the mere filing of this lawsuit is already the exercise of a veto point in itself. This is because this case took more than 14 years to be decided, and in the meantime, the status quo was strongly favored. Thirdly and finally, I tried to verify how all of this was also reflected in the concession contracts and in the day-to-day implementation of the public policy within the scope of the governmental process. All this has led to several conclusions. I won't go into details because of the focus here of this presentation is the application of the law and public policies approach, and not to explore the results per se. But it could be good, interesting knowing some of the material results of the research in a short way. In this sense, the research showed mainly that the design of the sanitation policy of 2007 was not able to break with the current institutional trajectory. And despite of having introduced a modern model with a clear or a separation between provider, planner, regulator, and operator, in practice, these roles are confused. And legally qualified veto points in various public policies processes contribute to maintaining the status quo. And finally, I would like to say that some of these issues were addressed in the 2020 legal reform, but not all of them. And also new problems and issues were created with the new law, but that's a subject for another time. So that's all. With that, I close my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. And thank you for observing the time. And I wonder if Professor Clune wants to make any comment, or what would you prefer? Or we go to the other presentations, to the whole block?
Well, first of all, that was a beautiful set of PowerPoints, and I admire you for that. You know, that's very rich presentation, a lot to think about. I saw so many parts of the law and public policy framework, and so clearly spelled out the notion of veto points, and the overlapping of national and local interests, and also discussion of models for delivery that are somewhat muddled in practice. And in terms of my research questions, in the beginning, you talked about how politics is essential to it. I assume you get into what is the politics behind the different movements. Of course, that key case, that 14-year long case, which is an amazing length, it's almost Dickensian, like Bleak House, that the estate that goes on forever and never dies, but is itself a kind of veto. So, I mean, having the politics be highlighted, I'd be interested in knowing more about that, you know, because that's the energy surrounding all of these different movements to and fro. And I like the institutional framework. I think that's right. You know, in my blog in the Appendix A, I have the relevance, explaining the relevance of the institutional framework, and I like path dependence. That all seems very good to me. So very good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Clune. Now we are going to see Gabriela. I don't know if Sergio wants to. Do you want to say something?
No, I want to thank Professor Clune for his comments. But now I want to see the other presentations too. Thank you. I'm assimilating the comments.
Okay, thank you, Sergio. So now it's Gabriela's turn.
Okay.
Gabriela is showing also a presentation. Okay.
Yeah, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Everything's okay.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Professor Maria Paula, thank you for the invitation. Professor Clune, thank you for being here with us at this meeting. It's a pleasure to be here. My ongoing research focuses on the institutionalization of a specific model of social policies in Brazil, the unified system or national system model. The emergence of this model is related to two major changes resulting from Brazilian Constitution of 1988. The first concerns the social welfare paradigm, which includes the provision of social rights and universal and equal access to public policies related to health, social assistance, and education, moving away from a previous conservative model of welfare policies to a universal one. The second change refers to the federal arrangement that moved from a centralized federalism to a cooperative model of shared responsibilities by two levels of government and with great socioeconomic asymmetries between them. And among several models of public policies adopted in order to implement social rights under these new constitutional rules, the unified system or the national system model, originating from the health policy, has been spread into different areas. That's why they are relevant as the study object. The main threads of unified system are 6. 1, national standards of social provision. 2, specific responsibilities for each level of government. 3, federal coordination. 4, decentralized execution of programs. 5, intergovernmental committees for policy decision-making. And 6, share funding for these activities. At this point, it's worth clarifying the role that states and municipalities play in unified system arrangements, because on one hand, they have some participation in the formulation of national policies, especially in the intergovernmental committees, and eventually can influence the legislative process too. On the other hand, they are recipients of legal incentives and sanctions. So even though they are autonomous units who carry out their own policies, they can also be seen as regulated organizations. And specifically, my work compares the trajectories by which the unified health system and the unified social assistance system were institutionalized, as well as the attempt to establish the national education system, what hasn't happened so far. My study rebuilds legal institutional factors that could explain different paths and outcomes in implementation of the systems. Furthermore, it investigates if there is any common resilience between system arrangements in different areas, which is a relevant point to analyze if the spreading of this model protects the welfare state as a whole in periods of social policies retrenchment. Therefore, as shown in the table, my analysis model consists of three main parts: the pre-constitutional scenario, the legal institutional development, and the public policy institutionalized. The pre-constitutional scenario contains a synthesis of each public policy before the 1988 Constitution. It's based no quadro de problemas de uma política pública. That means it's based on the public policies problems framework developed by Ruiz and Bucci. The legal institutional development comprises a description of transformations enacted since 1988 according to an adaptation of the political model of implementation by Professor Clune. And finally, the public policy institutionalized brings a contemporary portrait of the legal institutional design of these policies in accordance with the reference framework of a public policy also developed by Professor Bucci. As the table shows, the political model is a useful instrument to organize and to compare the three social policies development through successive downward and upward cycles. The description of cycles and interactions highlights, first, how strategies from the national level can favor the convergence of subnational policies to national guidelines. Second, how intergovernmental relations have influenced the institutional design of systems in different areas. And third, how the feedback from the implementation of these policies changed or reinforced their underlying status in upward cycles. To that extent, it's a tool to understand how the Brazilian welfare state has been built and reformulated over time in this alluvial process. But note that the research emphasizes the interaction between the different levels of government and the outcomes of these actions on the contemporary arrangement of the systems under investigation. But new research agendas can use the same frameworks to deepen the relationship between social participation and the development of the unified systems. So this is a snapshot of my current research, mainly in the methodological issues involved in it. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gabriela, for your presentation. Very interesting case to use the framework. And I asked Professor Clune if he wants to make any comment.
Well, again, that was a very rich presentation, and thank you for that. It made me think of the parallel in the United States with the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare, and how it was a system that rather than going directly to, universal Medicare, which would have been the simplest system, and maybe that's what is present, say, in Germany or some in Scandinavian. We have this very multi-layered and complex system of with different roles for the states, and of course a political actor being the insurance companies that didn't want to lose their role and the profits they make. So thinking about both Sergio and this presentation, it made me think of, you take sanitation and healthcare. What are they about? The health of the people. I mentioned human development is kind of the forward edge of progressivism, and people who are left without sanitation, their health declines, and education and everything. And then healthcare is a remedy for that, but also allows people to be well and prosper and not have financial disasters and so on. So those are both that fit the model of I think the forward edge of human development. So thank you for that presentation. It's a lot to absorb on the fly, but.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Clune. Gabriela wants to say something?
Oh, thank you for the comments. I want to say once again that the political model of implementation has been a very important contribution for my research. I could organize it in a very different way after having studied and translating it. So thank you, Professor Butch, for the opportunity, and thank you, Professor Clune, for the article.
Thank you. I'm honored, and there certainly was a lot of downward and upward cycles involved in what you said.
Yes, thank you. So now we can go to Frederico, the streets, social function of the streets.
Okay, can you see it?
Yes. No.
Okay.
Yeah. No, it's okay. We can. Okay, go on.
So good evening to everybody. Thanks very much to Professor Maria Paula for the invitation. Thanks very much for Professor Clune for his presence here. That honors all of us. And thanks for my colleagues for sharing this time with me. I'm going to briefly present my master research that ended in 2019 and is about urban streets regulation, which I studied under the law and public policy approach, like my colleagues. My presentation is divided in 5 major steps. First, I'm going to say a few words about the relevance of this subject and why I chose to study it. Then I'm going to talk about the consequences of the car-centered model for the city functioning and the urban life as a whole. Then I'm going to try to show how law contributed to spread this model around the world, including in Brazilian cities and American cities. I'm going to present a typology which I developed in my master research concerning the decisions that local governments make regarding urban street uses. And finally, I'm going to try to show the importance of this kind of exercise and why it's helpful for policymakers and researchers who are concerned on the urban question. So starting with the urban streets relevance. In my opinion, the urban streets are the main public goods in cities. And for sure, they are one of the most strategic state assets, especially when it comes to local governments. Urban streets are also the public space per excellence. If we consider their scale, their capillarity, their multiple functions, they appear as an irreplaceable physical support for the exercise of citizenship. And what makes more complex and more difficult and also more important to study them and to deal with them is that they are not subject to one public policy, but to several that go much beyond mobility and includes infrastructure, health, culture, environment, energy, economic, human rights, education, and so on, because of the multiple uses they can support. And because of these multiple uses and the multiple groups and interests that surrounds urban streets, there is an intrinsic distributional conflict when it comes to managing and regulating urban streets. And that's the theory. But when we look to the reality and how urban streets are really shaped and regulated for the last decades, including now in Brazil, US, and so on, we can see that the car-central model is hegemonic and it brought profound and huge transformations and consequences for the urban life. So it's the literature clearly points that it deepened the existing and creating new forms of inequalities, exacerbating social exclusion and territorial segregation. It also eliminated or restricted many essential functions of streets, especially free and open uses, the secondary uses that's not related with circulation. And despite all these negative externalities, this car-central model was unable to deliver an efficient model, a system of mobility from any perspective we adopt, social, economic, or environmental. So this whole process highlights the profound interdependence between urban planning and transport planning, not just the land regulation and how the city is produced affects the transport planning, but also how we shape, build, and regulate urban streets. It's an important element to understand the conditions of urbanistic interventions. And as I said before, law was a key element for the spread of this model. First, because an entirely legal framework legitimated this model, and after legitimation, the law provided institutional basis for the model's incremental self-reproduce. So what we have now, and for the last decades, is that huge transformations that seems to be compatible with this model became very naturally accepted for everyone, including the authorities, legislative authorities, executive authorities, judiciary authorities, while very small interventions in the opposite way turned into serious offenses to the established order. And even now, after the social movements and the urban movements pressed for legal reforms in the urbanistic law, we still see a big contrast between the legal city that points in a more democratic, fair, and sustainable way of using urban streets, and the real city where the car still reigns, and this pattern of policy still reigns. So as law contributed in the past to the spread of the model, I defend that we should consider law as a key to contribute in demystifying and politicizing streets planning and management, considering their social purpose. In this direction, I built a typology, an open typology that should and could be improved by other researchers and policymakers to systematize what kind of decisions that local governments take all the time concerning the urban street uses. The first family of decisions comprise street division between modules, applicable rules to each part and each module, and the definition on rules and the construction of the infrastructure that integrates the parts and become feasible the interaction of the modules. And the second family comprise the decisions of temporary of secondary uses that can be permanent uses or temporary uses. I'm gonna give some examples to make more clear what I'm talking about. So when it comes to the first family, examples of streets division between modules are sidewalks width definition, bike path installation, bus rapid transport construction, and others. When it comes to applicable rules to each part or each module, we can give as examples the speed limit definitions, especially when it comes to motorized vehicles, periodic bus lanes, car restrictions, as we have here in São Paulo and other Brazilian cities, or toll fees, as they have in London. And when it comes to rules and infrastructure to interaction and integration, some examples are crosswalk installation, traffic light time, rules on garage ramps, and others. And passing to the second family, we have in the permanent secondary uses as examples, newsstand permissions, pole lights, installation, tree planting, parklets implementation. As examples of periodic uses, the street markets authorization or the use of streets for leisure on weekends. And finally, as when it comes to ad hoc uses, we can mention authorization for street parties, cultural or political demonstrations, and the authorization for sports and culinary events. Many others could be mentioned, but this is some examples just to illustrate what the typology is touching when it comes to this kind of decisions. And finally, why do I think this kind of exercise is important and is helpful for researchers and policymakers? First, because I think it helps on decomposing and organizing the public choices regarding streets regulation. and also to understand and interpret the legal framework applicable to urban streets as a whole, according to their social purpose, and also helps us to infer the legal parameters that should be observed in each decision, in each kind of decision, each type of decision. It also highlights the opposed interests concerning the street uses, and because of that contributes on arbitrating the conflicts in order to optimize the common welfare. And because of all of that, I finally think and believe that this kind of typology and theoretical exercise, looking very empirically to the reality, helps in increasing the quality of streets regulation and management, because only when these decisions became more democratic, the uses of the streets will become more democratic. And that's it. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Frederico. It's an interesting presentation. I ask Professor Clune if he wants to make any remark.
Well, you know, the United States has the car as king, just as you do, or more so. And in terms of path dependence, there was enormous investment and subsidy of, vehicle transportation in the United States, so that any changes are path dependent and that they must adapt to these multiple institutional forms. But when we speak of institutions, I think that presentation showed how many intersecting institutional forces are at work. You know, I would say that in the United States, you can hardly go a day in any city without seeing these issues discussed. And many times the reforms are just making small changes in one of the elements, I guess. But yeah, if you understand the whole array of them and where there may be leverage and places to move, I thought the presentation of models was very good in this, that there are, I guess Maria Paula's called it aggregated social knowledge about how to approach things. So we don't come completely ignorant to these issues. And also it's such a big part of, having a humanistic and livable city and all the consequences of that. So thank you for that presentation.
Thank you, Professor. Frederico?
I just want to thank you very much, Professor, for his comments. Really.
So thank you, Frederico. Now we come to Isabella. We have two more, Isabella and then Alexander. Isabella.
Good evening, Professor Maria Paula. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Professor Clune. I am very happy and very honored to present my research to you and to my colleagues this evening. My presentation is a part of my master's research in which I analyzed the legal institutional arrangement of social assistance policy in Brazil. My research is divided in two parts. In the first part, I analyze the process of institutional construction of the social assistance policy in Brazil, especially after the promulgation of the Federal Constitution in 1988, since the constitutional text included the social assistance as one of the social rights to be guaranteed by the Brazilian state. And I focus my analysis in the period between 2003 and 2014, in which I observed the organization of a national system to provide social assistance services and benefits. This national system is called SUAS, the Unified Social Assistance System. And in the second part of my research, I analyzed the resilience of this arrangement. I identified some initiatives to modify the previously built design of SUAS, especially in this period between 2016 and 2020, in a context of fiscal crisis and health crisis caused by the COVID-19. So based on my research findings, I organize and categorize the disruptive measures of SUAS in this period between 2016 and 2020. And I propose an analytical framework for the legal study of the dismantling of a public policy. The framework foresees 6 dimensions of destructuring: organizational, substantive, participatory, financial, articulation, and instrumental. So next, I'll present the 6 dimensions, and I'll try to illustrate them with examples from the social assistance policy. So the first dimension is the organizational dimension that concerns the existence of a managing body for the policy. In 2004, a specific ministry was created to manage the social assistance policy in the federal level, separated from the social security policy as it used to be in the past. And in the subnational jurisdictions, the existence of an exclusive management body is considered a proxy to reveal the degree of institutionality of the public policy at the local level. In the period between 2016 and 2020, the management of social assistance was unified with other policies. And in the subnational levels, the management unification can reduce resources to execute the policy, especially the number of professionals available to carry out the social assistance actions. The second dimension is the substantive dimension that concerns the content of the policy. During the implementation of SUAS, I can observe a progressive regulation of social assistance provisions. For example, in 2009, the federal government organized a typology of social assistance services to standardize the offers all over the national territory. But in 2016, the federal government created a new program called Programa Criança Feliz, the Happy Child Program, which was interpreted by some of the social workers as a waste of human and financial resources, because the main activity of this program was to do home visits, which already was included in the social work with families of other existing services. The participatory dimension concerns the arenas to engage civil society, social movements, and policy users in the decision-making process of the policy. The social assistance federal law encourages the creation and functioning of social assistance councils in all federal jurisdictions, and also the realization of periodic conferences for discussing and evaluating the public policy actions. And in 2019, there was an internal dispute in the National Social Assistance Council between representatives of the government and civil society about the formal call for a national conference that year. The civil society managed to approve the call, but then the ministry argued that the quorum to approve the call was inappropriate, so the formal call was canceled. But the conference happened anyway that year as a result of the mobilization of public and private agents that considers the conference as an important participatory arena to discuss the policy. The financial dimension concerns instruments to finance the policy. In SUAS, benefits and services are co-founded by federal, state, and municipal entities. We have the National Social Assistance Fund in the federal level that gathers federal resources. And the law encourages the creation of subnational funds as a condition for states and cities to receive transfers by the federal government. And that mechanism is called fund-to-fund transfer, and it guarantees the regularity of federal, the transfers from federal resources to the subnational entities. In 2019, a new rule from the federal government conditioned new federal transferences to the previous year budget execution by the subnational entities. And that new rule broke the previous regularity of federal transfers, which is a problem because it caused funding insecurity, especially to the small cities that has less funding capacity. The articulation dimension concerns the interfederative relations. In SUAS, we have a tripartite intermanagement commission at the federal level, the CITI, which is an arena that gathers representatives from management bodies of the union, states, and municipalities to discuss the operational aspects of the public policy implementation. In 2019, a presidential decree extinguished most of the collegiate bodies of the federal public administration, and among them, CITI was also considered extinct. Shortly after that, the subnational managers pressured the federal government to reinstall the CITI, and that episode showed the political strength of this policy design. CITI is considered an important coordination arena for the policy. The last one is the instrumental dimension that refers to the instruments of implementation. In SUAS, we have Cadastro Único, the unified registry, which is an important instrument of the policy because it identifies low-income families and individuals, and it also allows the integrated management of benefits and services. In 2020, the Congress approved the Auxílio Emergencial, the emergency aid for informal workers during the pandemic. And the federal government decided to use a mobile application to identify the beneficiaries of this aid. So Cadastro Único was underused in the implementation of this aid. And that created a problem because it made very difficult to integrate the beneficiaries of the emergency aid into the social assistance services. So finally, I would like to say that this analytical framework was designed to contribute with the law and public policy approach. It is an instrument for law researchers to investigate processes of institutional dismantling of public policies from a legal perspective, and hopefully in an inverse way as an instrument to study processes of institutional construction and reconstruction. That's it. Thank you for the opportunity, Professor.
Thank you, Isabella. Very interesting. I ask if Professor Clune wants to make a comment.
Well, thank you, Isabella. So I guess I think of this as part of the constellation of policies that could move toward universal basic income if there weren't so many different pieces and conflicts and different programs. You know, we have unemployment compensation, we have food stamps, we have all manner and forms of assistance, and many of them are difficult for low-income people to apply for and have work requirements and various burdensome things. And out there at the horizon is a much more efficient system that would have many more public benefits, but it is moving toward that once again as this path dependence of a whole collection of different policies and agencies that are moving in one direction and moving in another direction. And so, and I'm not sure it's interesting trying to understand the Brazilian context in comparison to ours. It's very challenging to, and it would require much more detailed understanding of the Brazilian system than I have. But anyway, that was rich presentation, and I appreciate it. Thank you, Isabella.
Thank you, Professor. Isabella wants to say something.
I want to thank Professor for the comments, and I hope we have other opportunities to talk further about the specific policies. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, to close this section, we are going to see something different because there's a perspective from the judiciary, and I'm going to call Alexandra to present her work, please.
Just a minute. Let's see. So, well, good evening, everyone. Professor Butcher, thank you for the invitation. Professor Clune, thank you for your presence here. It's a pleasure to be here. The objective of my dissertation was to investigate the ability of the judiciary to carry out a more efficient control of housing public policies. The Brazilian judiciary has many legal instruments to control public policies, but when the subject involves land conflicts, there is some difficulty in dealing with constitutional values. So, the traditional idea that the legal right is fixed because the law says so has still an autonomous force. But modern law contains a diminished sense of law as a source of security and commitment, enabling judges to emphasize constitutional values. So my objective was to find ways based on the Constitution and the Civil Procedure Code of 2015 to weaken the authority of some Brazilian institutes concerning protection of property in its more traditional sense, in order to make them more compatible with constitutional values. In my work, I had some basic assumptions. First, the judiciary doesn't deal well with lawsuits involving the fundamental right of housing, especially concerning expropriation and repossession. This fundamental right might be infringed upon, thus bringing consequences to the community as a whole and to the city, the city's land distribution. Second, people removed from a territory in compliance with a judgment in expropriation or repossession suit are not formal parties. They are not owners, but they still suffer the consequences of the judgment, as well as the city as a whole. Third, the ordinary solutions adopted by the judicial power based on the traditional sense of law overlook the right to housing of the poorest and the legislation about urban territory. Norms involving expropriation and repossession must be interpreted from the point of view of the constitutional perspective in the Civil Procedure Code of 2015. They already have legal instruments to change the traditional sense of law concerning urban land and expropriation and repossession. In particular, judges can create in the process an environment for negotiation and cooperation between interested parties, while encouraging the government to preserve the fundamental right to housing, but it seldom helps. Aiming to protect the fundamental right to housing of the poorest people in expropriation and repossession While maintaining democratic institutions, I created the Guide of Judicial Review of Public Policy to support judges and interested parties in lawsuits related to land conflicts. The guide is inspired by the Quadro de Problemas na Política Pública, that means Public Policies Problems Framework, and can be used in conflicts or disputes involving consequences to the right to housing of the poorest people. The main idea is to stimulate the development of housing public policies and to support judicial decisions that provoke the government to find better solutions to expropriation and repossession. The guide doesn't create law. It uses the Constitution and the Procedure Code. Therefore, it only uses legal instruments already available in the Civil Procedure Code and encourages new ways to use them. The goal is to push judges to take a more active and strategic role in the process, overcoming the procedural limits of traditional law. The guide has 4 tables, one for each stage of the Brazilian process: pleading, answer, discovery, and execution. I won't go into details about them because of the particular aspects of Brazilian legal code. However, this is a brief overview. For the pleading stage, there are 5 questions presented to the judge. They help to highlight problems of the trial involving housing public policy that are not clear in the complaint. They also help the judge to find a way to invite social actors related to housing public policy to join the process. One of the questions is it possible and appropriate to expand the objective and subjective limits of the dispute? If not, will the conflict be resolved? For the answer stage, there is a table of 5 questions. They help the judge to extract from the answer stage counterclaims involving public policy. They also help to understand housing public policy at stake and also invite social actors to join in the process. Thus, they help the judge to consider the housing public policy problem and have instruments to call the government to negotiate a better solution. 2 questions of this table are there rights of different generations in conflict and therefore different concepts of possession and possessory claims? Is there an implicit legal basis involved? Is it possible to bring it up on the basis of CPC's Article 10? Table 3, the discovery stage. This stage has 9 questions and are devoted to encourage the judge to conduct preliminary and mediation hearings before the discovery stage. In Brazil, preliminary and mediation hearings in lawsuits involving government entities are uncommon. And the idea is to foster these preliminary and mediation hearings with government and other parties involved. It can be a good strategy to make all of them understand that there is a public policy problem at stake. So then it will enable the judge to consider the housing public policy problem and call the government to negotiate a better solution for the conflict. 2 questions of this table are: is it convenient to have a mediation hearing before the pleading stage, or many mediation hearings in the pleading stage? Is it convenient to deliver the judgment in parts, rolling the case in phases or stages? Is it more convenient to suspend the process while there is not a clear political definition of the public policy? Table 4. This table has 5 questions, and the objective is to help judges to apply efficient inductive measures in the beginning of the process to ensure compliance. Also, they can remove the highest number of obstacles to a successful implementation of the judgment concerning housing public. For instance, what are the possible obstacles of the execution of the title in the future? And these obstacles, though not controversial points in themselves, be negotiated before the pleading phase. So, the guide can bring to the surface the housing public policy at stake and its normative context, thereby increasing the use of new tools of the new procedure code and help the judiciary to preserve constitutional values. Thank you for your attention. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Alexandra. And with this, we close our presentations. And yes, okay. I would ask if Professor Clune wants to make any comment.
Well, that was fascinating presentation, Alexandra. And you are a judge currently, is that correct?
Yes, I'm a judge in São Paulo.
So that would be part of one thing that's remarkable. And it sounds, whereas the courts in our system are more reactive and even reactionary, it sounds like the courts in Brazil using the Constitution can be more proactive, potentially anyway, and that would be an interesting point of comparison in itself. It relates to some of the other presentations. It sounds like, well, I think I'm going to get to the welfare point, the welfare state point last. One point that really jumped out at me was the prevalence of property as a dominating concern in housing policies, so that all compensation and limits on expropriation and so on are involve property owners and not the landless and the poor. So the notion of a judicial right for the landless to, let's say, have standing, I guess we would say it in our system, to be participants in a reform process, to be recognized so that the impact on them is part of the decision, strikes me as a wonderful revolutionary idea. And I hope that it can move forward in some way. Sort of in conclusion, I would say in several of the presentations, I have the idea that the Brazilian welfare state in all its aspects is in some ways maybe moving towards something like we had in the New Deal in pieces, and I don't know how that is, it's taking form and moving towards some form of universalistic legal structures, and maybe this is your New Deal taking shape, if that's maybe a far-fetched analogy, and whereas we are struggling not to go backwards from the New Deal, but anyway, thank you all for your presentations. Most informative, most interesting, and provocative. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And well, I think expropriation here in Brazil, my work is concerns about the big infrastructure events in the city.
Yeah.
And it was not possible to put everything in the slides. So, but it would be very nice for me if I could talk more about this work in a further occasion.
Yeah, I wanted to mention, I forgot that the notion of property. So, we've just had a series of articles on United States intervention in Haiti, where, first of all, the Marines were sent in to compensate a bank, and they took all the gold from the central bank of Haiti. This was back in where U.S. Crude colonialism. But more generally in the law of slavery, it was the slave owners who were compensated because they had property and slaves, and the slaves were not compensated, even though they were the ones most harmed by the system of slavery. I think that's an example of the bias of property and the value that would have been served by recognizing, and giving some standing to those who were most hurt. And of course, in conservative politics in the United States, and I think probably in Brazil, property is given such an elevated level of respect and kind of sacred. You can't do anything about property. So that has a lot of resonance to cross-culturally, I believe. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Clune. I think we are coming to the conclusion of our session. And first of all, I want to thank all the researchers who presented their works. I am very proud. I have supervised. Just Gabriela is not under my supervision. She's under the supervision of a colleague, of Professor Tojal. But I think they did great. And I think it's a sample of what we could do. In a certain way, we are in a bubble, I don't know if we can be seen as the sample of all that happens in Brazil. I think it's a particular way of seeing, and a particular way linked or connected to this progressive purpose. So, for instance, Isabella, she could show we are passing through a huge setback. When she a kind of elegant way, she focused the period between 2016 and 2020. This is a period of a huge setback. And I think, I hope this will pass. We are going to have elections in October, and we are going to need to have that I said before, a repertoire of procedures, of political design, and a legal knowledge about this, because I think there was traditionally an improvisation in this field. And if each politician who started a new period brings ideas of public policies, we don't know where. And so I think the mission, or my effort here, is to develop a more structured way with better connections, with connection more explicit or more understandable between the legal topic and the environment, which means political issues, economic issues, social issues, etc.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, please go on. I would like to remark just another thing is that when these works started to be produced in 2016, 2017, 2018, we didn't know yet your material. And I think we are going to develop much more in other works now using these frameworks and your model, But yeah, please.
These setbacks are very difficult to deal with. And but there are rays of hope. I meant to mention with, I guess elections are coming up in Colombia. And I just saw a program on their environmental policies, creating sea protection reservations for fish and marine wildlife, and how many of the Pacific, the countries on the Pacific in South America and Central America are adopting similar policies. And so just as you think nothing can make progress, all of a sudden in one area or another, sudden progress is made. And I think that's the nature of the world we live in.
Okay, I think we have had a splendid conversation. We reached our time, and I think I would like to point out the generosity of Professor Clune. In a certain way, I have been against the good protocol, but I think we are celebrating Professor Clune's pioneer work and creating conditions for us to see ourselves outside of that our Brazilian box, and how is to dialogue. And last thing, when you talked about that North-South dialogue or South-North dialogue or intercultural dialogue, I think we have reached a wrong position that says everything that puts us in a maybe in an inferior condition. I think we have learned a lot with your articles and with your ideas about issues in the US, but I think we have produced something in Brazil, especially in this democratic period among the between the Constitution in 1988 and 2016. And I think this is the material we show work is our responsibility to work and to build some kind of or some prototypes, right, as you say, for the new social state. I hope we are getting someday. So I would like to close this session to thanking Professor Clune once more for everything he has written, every bit of intelligence in that articles, and for the generosity of being with us for the second time, giving us 2 hours of your precious time. It was a splendid session for me. Thank you very much, Professor Clune.
Well, thank you. It was delightful to be with you. It's very nice to see so many young people in this field. I always think working with graduate students and young people is one of the real pleasures in life. And as you know from my birthday, I have a lot of seniority over all of you. So it was a special delight to talk to you today, and thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor. I would like just to ask the students to remain here in the room, and the researchers if they can, and we'll let Professor Clune rest and have a good night.
Thank you. I'm going to press the leave button and see what happens.
Yeah.
Leave.